Okay. Hi, thanks for coming. So I'm really happy to introduce Professor Jen Smart. So Jen is a year in post now? 2 years. 2 years, sorry. 2 years the head of conservation science for Scotland and Northern Ireland, and that's with the RSPB, and it's for the Centre for Conservation Science. So Jenny's going to be talking about how she got to where she is, and also using how the RSPB uses conservation science to try and prevent extinctions, specifically in the UK. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Kirsty. Hi everyone, thanks for coming, and thanks for Kirsty inviting me to come today. So yes, I'm eventually going to talk about this, but I've been reliably informed that the sort of non-academic content of these seminars is quite important as well. So it's going to be a sort of 3-part talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I got to where I am today. I hate talking about myself, but I did have a slightly non-standard career path, so I think it's it's quite useful to understand that you don't have to just go through this straight trajectory through university and PhD and all that sort of thing. There's other ways of going about it. And then I'm going to talk a bit about the RSPB Centre for Conservation Science, just to give you an idea of what we do, who we are, what we do, how we do conservation science. And then I'm going to end with a sort of species conservation project that I've been really heavily involved with before I ended up in Scotland, because this species doesn't occur in Scotland. But it's a good example of how we do conservation science to save species from extinction. No, it's not moving on. Oh, there we go. There we go. So I grew up in Montrose, which is sort of northeast Scotland, just south of Aberdeen, and I didn't grow up wanting to be an ornithologist or a conservation scientist. I went all the way through school wanting to be a nurse, and then went to do my nursing training and hated it. So 6 months into that, I jacked that in, and I spent a year going, oh my God, what the hell am I going to do with my life? And then eventually I went to this careers conference, and there was somebody there who told me you could do a career in conservation. I mean, it wasn't even anything I thought that you could do. So I went from that careers conference to a local technical college in Arbroath, and I spent a year doing a national certificate, learning all about sort of practical conservation skills, and I absolutely loved that. So I went from there to Agricultural College in Ayrshire, went to Auchincruive for 2 years and did an HND in conservation management. And on my way to college, my mum took me out. My mum's always been really interested in birds. She took me out to Bass Rock to see the gannets and the puffins and everything else. And that, in my mind, that is the first sort of mind-blown experience that I had with birds. Up until that point, I was just really interested in the countryside, but I didn't have a specific focus. So that was my first experience with birds that I really remember, being my mind being blown about it. After I finished at Auchincruive, I was really lucky to get a job with the National Trust for Scotland. So I worked as the countryside ranger at Clane Castle and Country Park for a couple of years. And then from there, I moved down south. When you're doing sort of contracts, you just have to sort of go where the work is. So I went down south and I worked for a small conservation charity in Oxfordshire as a reserve warden for a year. And that's where I learned how to drive a tractor, I learned how to operate a chainsaw, I learned how to lamb sheep. We had a flock of 200 ewes and I did a season of lambing and learned all sorts of practical skills. But by that time, I was really getting into birding, and there were 2 guys on the reserve that I was looking after who were bird ringing in the woods every weekend. And they took me on as a trainee bird ringer, and that's where I started bird ringing. So I went from there to the south coast, again moving for a job, but I actually got a permanent job with Hampshire County Council as a countryside ranger, and that's where I met my next ringing trainer, who was mostly a wader ringer, and that's where my obsession with waders began. The first wader I ever handled was a greenshank. That's quite a rare bird, and spent a whole year ringing with him on the south coast of England, getting lots and lots of wader experience. He then made the mistake for him of taking me up to the Wash for a week's wader ringing expedition on the Wash. And that really was a sort of turning point in my career and my life, because I met loads of people on the Wash who've become lifelong friends, mentors. I met my husband there, all sorts of things. So very quickly, Jenny Gill, who's pictured in this photo here, convinced me that going to the University of East Anglia and doing a degree in ecology was the next important stage in my career. And that's really when my science career started. So I was 27 when I went to university to do my ecology degree. I got into second year entry because I already had an HND, so that was great. And in England, you only do 3 years, but I took a year. I took a year out between my second and third year, and I did a whole bunch of sort of contracts, research contracts, sort of bird conservation contracts. I worked for the RSPB protecting little terns nesting on a beach in Great Yarmouth. I worked for Jenny at the university on her long-term black-tailed godwit study. So we were studying wintering black-tailed godwits of the Icelandic race that come here in winter. And then I got my first RSPB research contract working on black-tailed godwits in the Cambridgeshire Fens. And at the end of that year, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I knew that I wanted to work in conservation science and that I wanted to work in bird conservation. So my third year of my degree, all my choices were around that career path that I'd already decided I wanted to do, and knowing that I needed to do a PhD in order to realise that career. So I very quickly went from my degree to a PhD at UEA, working on breeding redshanks with Jenny and others. And at the end of that PhD, I did that whole, do I stay in academia? What do I do? It was always academia or RSPB. Those were the two choices for me. I did a short postdoc, just 6 months, and then an opportunity came up at the RSPB, and I went for it and got it. So that was in 2006, and I was really, lucky to be offered a contract as a conservation scientist, and that's really where my career at RSPB began, and I've been there ever since. And so this slide just shows a sort of selection of the papers that I've published over the years, just to show you really the range of things that I've worked on. So early in my career, when I was still doing contract work, I was dabbling and trying all sorts of different things. So I spent some time working on woodland birds. I did a project on persecution and red kites. And then eventually more wader work came up and I got back to doing wader work. And really the rest of my career was focused around waders and lowlands, on intertidal habitats in the uplands, and specifically about the sort of conservation interventions that we can use to reduce the impacts of predators, because that's one of the big drivers of wader declines, and also testing the efficacy of agri-environment schemes. And I've had a sort of long, largely in the background interest in the impacts of all the game bird releasing that goes on. And really, I mean, one thing to say here is that I couldn't have done any of this without all the people that I've worked with over the years. So, at the RSPB, not just my science colleagues, but our conservation practitioners, the people that are delivering stuff on the ground, and our policy and advocacy teams who are out there trying to get the science that we're doing into sort of government policies or RSPB policies sometimes. And also, the sort of academic collaborations that I've had, and a whole raft of MSc and PhD students that I've worked with over the years. So really, all of that input from all of those people combined has sort of led to this career. And I also think it's just worth pointing out, I mean, that was the academic stuff. I think it's worth pointing out all the other things that I think have been really important in terms of getting me where I am now. So in 2012, I was given an honorary lectureship at UEA in recognition of all the work I'd done with the staff and students there. So that was really a real honour. In 2013, I started working with the BOU, the British Ornithologists Union, voluntary position, chairing their engagement committee, first of all, and then chairing their committee that manages their journal IBIS. So those two things both taught me an awful lot about journal management and about how to engage with sort of ornithological communities more widely, and all that time sitting on the BOU Council as well. So that gave me an understanding of the sort of governance around these sorts of organisations. In 2014, as part of my job at the RSPB, I was offered an opportunity to project manage the launch of the Centre for Conservation Science. So we'd always had a science team, and we had this big review done of our science that told us that the science we were doing was akin to the science of a university institute. But people didn't know enough about it. The people who did the review thought they knew what the RSPB did and thought they knew what we did, but they were blown away by what we did when we presented it all to them. And they said it needs to be better known. So what we did is we created the RSPB Centre for Conservation Science, and we launched that in 2014. So I project managed all of the activities around the launch of that. And that took me away from science that year for a bit, but I learned about website design. I learned about how to set up and run social media accounts. I learned about working with loads of other people around the RSPB. I got to network with loads of people that came to our events when we launched them, and all sorts of things that have been really useful in sort of lots of the things I've done subsequently. And then in 2019, I made quite a big move, maybe a bold move. I actually moved away from conservation science for a little bit to work as head of species for RSPB England. And really that job was about using the science that we produce to influence policy and practice. So I was suddenly no longer doing the science, I was a customer of the science. And that really, really showed me how important our science is in underpinning all of the sort of policy and conservation decisions that the RSPB makes, and arms our teams with the information that they need to go out and lobby governments and other organisations about the sorts of changes that we need in order to deliver for nature and climate. Now, 2020 was a dreadful year for obvious reasons for lots of people. I actually quite enjoyed lockdown. I really enjoyed the relaxed nature of it all. I lived in a little village, didn't have any children at home trying to school them or anything like that. So I had a really sort of fairly relaxed lockdown. It was actually quite good. But what was really good for me in 2020 was the latter part of the year. Loads of really exciting things happened for me at that point. First thing that happened was I became the chair of the International Water Study Group, which is an organisation that I've been a member of for a couple of decades now. I've been to their annual conferences nearly every single year. So to be asked to chair that international organisation was a huge honour. I cycled 600 miles in 8 days around southern England, following the migration routes of black-tailed godwits, raising money for godwit conservation. And that was hard, but brilliant, absolutely brilliant. It was great fun. Somebody nominated me for the Marsh Award for Ornithology, which I just could not quite believe. So I got given that, and that was amazing. And then I applied for this job and got this job. So there was just a whole raft of things that happened towards the end of 2020 that just sort of will make that year stand out in my memory forever. And then in 2021, I came full circle. I've done my whole migration round the country, back to Scotland, living near St Andrews, and managing the team and doing the job that I do now. So that's just a whistle-stop tour of my sort of 25-year, maybe a little bit more career, and how I've ended up standing here today doing the job that I'm doing today. So moving on to the second part then, just a bit about the RSPB Centre for Conservation Science. So this is our mission. It's to identify, provide and interpret scientific evidence that's needed to help the RSPB and others achieve a world richer in nature. So just a little thing that we do. And we do it by working at home in the UK, but we also work internationally, and we work in partnership with conservation policymakers and practitioners, universities and research institutes, statutory agencies and other environmental NGOs. So we're not doing it on our own, we're doing it with other people and other organisations. And sorry, did I jump ahead? No, I haven't jumped ahead, there we go. And you know, we only have a certain amount of resource to do this stuff. So we have to prioritise. We can't work on everything. Sometimes people say, well, why are you not interested in this bird species? Well, you know, we can't be interested in all of the 250 species that occur regularly in the UK. We just couldn't do it. So we prioritise, and we have lists of priority species. We have lists of priority habitats. We have lists of priority landscapes, which are places where we want to put more of our resources in because they're the special places that we feel we can have impact. And so we prioritise and we identify the most important problems, issues, species, things to work on. Once we've got, you know, an idea of what the most important things to work on are, then we want to, you know, what can we do about them? We want to know what we can do about them. So if it was a species conservation thing, say we'd identified that species X was declining, the next thing we do is, well, why is it declining? We do some research to understand why it's declining. Is it poor breeding success? Is it poor survival? You know, where is the problem occurring in the year, or is it a particular stage of their life cycle where it's occurring? Once we've got an idea of that, that then gives us an idea of, well, what can we do about it? What sort of things could we do to address the problem that we've identified? So let's just say for that species, we identified that it was poor overwinter survival driven by a lack of food in a key wintering habitat. You know, then we think, well, how can we manage that habitat to increase food and hopefully increase survival? And there might be, you know, there might be a few different ways you could do that. So we might test the different ways we can do it. We might deliver that in our reserves, or we might deliver that in our priority landscapes. But we'll do that until we're reasonably certain we've got a solution that might work for that species. And then usually what we have to do next, let's try and get the slides to move forward again. There we go. Every time somebody stands up, it decides to go. It's like the threat of the techie person coming to sort it out. Yeah, so once we've got a solution that we think might be the solution for that species, we usually then have to roll it out at scale, because we might be trying to deploy enough of that solution across the landscape to impact enough of the population to turn the population around. And so when we do that, we might have to be working with our policy teams to convince government to put this option as an agri-environment option. We might be working with our reserve teams to deliver that habitat management on the reserves. And we might be working with our other conservation practitioners who are out there talking to farmers all the time, convincing them what are the things they should be doing on their farms to protect nature. Or it could be all of those things. Often it is all of those things. And then what we would do as scientists is we'd come along, maybe 5 or 10 years down the line, or maybe even shorter, depending on the species, and say, has that rollout of this solution turned this population around, either regional or national population around? And if it hasn't, why hasn't it? And sometimes that requires us to go back a step or two, and sometimes it requires us to go back to the beginning again. It's not working. The solution we found, for some reason, farmers won't use it. They don't like it, or it's not practical, or so we might have to think again. So that's really just sort of how we think about these things and how we move things along. We've got this thing called the species recovery curve, where you're moving through these steps, and at each step you're hoping that the species is going to, it starts off going down, and then it might flatten out, and then you're hoping at the end that as you roll out these solutions, the species will start going back up again. So that's our mission and sort of how we do it, but who are we? Well, this is the Conservation Science Leadership Team. Jeremy Wilson, who some of you may know, is our Director of Science. Jerry used to do the job that I'm now doing. Now he's our Director of Science. And our leadership team consists of 5, we call them heads of function, but basically 5 people who head up different groups of scientists in the department, of which I'm one of them. And we have 2 sections that I always think of as sort of specialist sections. The monitoring section, who deals with everything to do with monitoring and biodiversity indicators and anything to do with collecting data about birds or biodiversity. They deal with that. So that's the monitoring section headed up by Richard Gregory. The people section headed up by Richard Bradbury. They contain our social scientists and our earth scientists. So that's who sits within Richard Bradbury's team. And then the other 3 heads of function look after sort of geographical groups of scientists. So Graham Buchanan heads up our international team, Will Peach heads up our England Wales team, and I head up the Scotland and Northern Ireland team. And then Tony at the end is our manager, and he keeps us all on the straight and narrow in relation to money, recruitment, project management, all those sorts of things. Very important person in the department. So what I'm going to do now is just give you an example or 2 from each of the other sections, and then a few examples from my team, just to sort of bring to life the range of stuff that we do. So these are 2 projects that the monitoring team have got on their plate this year. So we're running the 6th UK Hen Harrier Survey, and that's been led by Simon and Leah in the monitoring team, but also Arena, who's in my team. So we don't work in our sections, we don't never work together. We quite often work together. So it's a national hen harrier survey. Arena's looking after the sort of bit of the survey that's happening in Scotland, and Simon and Leah will be helped by other people in some of the other countries. So it's not just that we sit in our sections and never talk to one another. We do work together quite a lot on these things. So that's the hen harrier survey. The other big thing that the monitoring team are working on at the moment is the 4th UK State of Nature report. And that's a huge partnership project. There's over 50 partners now on the State of Nature partnership. And this is a report that gets produced, which describes the changes in a whole range of biodiversity over quite long time periods. So it's pulling together all the data we've got on biodiversity in the UK. And it looks at the causes of change, and it showcases some of the success stories, some of the conservation success stories. And this is a huge advocacy tool. It's used by our policy and advocacy teams all the time to try and convince governments that we need to do X, we need to do Y. And we produce country-specific reports as well, so that it's matched to the countries, because each of the countries are governed in slightly different ways and sometimes on slightly different trajectories in terms of things that might help nature and climate. Our social science team, quite a lot of what they're doing now is sort of supporting our landscape scale conservation work. So this is Antonia, who works in the people team. Antonia's got a project now which is part of a new landscape scale partnership in Cumbria called Connecting Cumbria. And so Antonia's work will look at, we'll talk to farmers and try to assess how farmer attitudes and identity and the relationships they have with the communities in these landscapes changes as a result of being part of a big landscape scale partnership that sort of has integrating sort of farm business within the sort of nature conservation outcomes within these landscapes. There's a whole load of other ecological and biological research that's going on as well, but this is just the social science element of our landscape work, and more now, our work will have those twin elements to it. Internationally, well, they get involved in a huge range of stuff, but one of the projects that the international team have been supporting for a very long time is the Gough Island Restoration Project. And right now, the science is really about understanding the impacts of our attempts to eradicate the predatory mice from this island. This island is in the middle of the Atlantic. I think it's a 6 or 8 day boat journey from South Africa to get there. It's hugely difficult to work in this island. And we attempted to eradicate these mice that were eating the seabird, adults and chicks and eggs. Unfortunately, that eradication attempt failed. We haven't managed to eradicate mice, but it has knocked the mouse population right back. And so what we've seen since we tried to eradicate them is this bounce back of the seabirds. So the blue bars are the breeding success post-eradication, and the sort of orangey, funny coloured bars are the sort of years before we tried to eradicate them. So we've seen a huge increase in breeding success in these globally threatened seabird species. And what will be really interesting, even though we haven't managed to eradicate the mice, it'll be really interesting to see how many years of relief these seabirds get before either the mouse populations get so big again, or they begin their predatory behaviour again. They might, in the early years, they might not exhibit that predatory behaviour. They might not need to. So that will be really interesting to see what happens there. So international team are involved in, they get to go to some really exciting, challenging places to do some of their work. This is a project being led by the England and Wales section by Tom Finch, and this is a treescapes project, a NERC-funded treescapes project, which is in partnership with Cardiff University and UHI. And this is really about looking at different approaches to treescapes expansions, a top-down sort of national approach or a bottom-up local approach, and trying to see what are the trade-offs in the way you can expand trees in these landscapes. They're using two different landscapes. The way you can expand trees in these landscapes, what are the trade-offs between taking those two different approaches? And I think that's a 2-year project that's just sort of really kicking off now. So over to my team now. So I've got around 25 people in my team. The numbers fluctuate depending on the time of year. We have a lot of seasonal staff, and we also have quite a lot of fixed term contracts. So if we have a big externally funded bit of work and we need a conservation scientist to work for 2 years on that project, we will advertise contracts to do those sorts of work, and they'll be managed by somebody who's established in the team, but they'll be brought in to do a very focused bit of project work. The people on this slide are the people who I directly line manage, and they each have their own teams beneath them. And above their pictures is sort of the areas, their real areas of interest, and below is the sort of species that they work on just now. Obviously, we can ask the team to go and learn and work on a new species at any time, but people do tend to have their sort of specialisms, and that's what these people are specialising on right now. So Lucy Mason on the left-hand end here. Lucy started with me 15 years ago, did an MSc project with me, and then came to work for me as a conservation scientist. Then we put her through a PhD by publication as she built up our publication library. And then when I moved to Scotland, Lucy was in the England team for a bit, and now I've got her back in my Scotland team again. So that's just, a route in. That was Lucy's route in, and Lucy is absolutely wonderful. So she's now my new senior conservation scientist, and she has 2 areas that she looks after. Well, we've generated this job specifically to plug a gap that I identified. The first thing is the restoration of Scotland's rainforest. We had nobody thinking about the science around the restoration of Scotland's rainforest. All the conservation teams are thinking about it. We've just got a brand new reserve that's a bit of Scotland's rainforest. So what Lucy's focusing on really is working with our conservation delivery teams to make sure that when they're putting together big funding bids that are to fund the delivery, the conservation delivery work that they need to do, Lucy's making sure that the monitoring and evaluation that needs to happen, so we know whether what we're doing is achieving what we wanted to achieve. Lucy's working with them to make sure that the monitoring and evaluation is embedded within those projects and get funded as part of those projects as well. And she's doing that for Scotland's rainforest, but she's also doing it for quite a few different breeding waded projects around Scotland as well now. David Douglas, who's Principal Conservation Scientist in my team, tends to look after sort of everything to do with uplands and knows a lot about grouse management for grouse shooting and stuff like that. And he's got a conservation scientist, contract conservation scientist in his team at the moment, Mike Shuring, who's leading this project, which is about using remote sensing to accurately map the way that moorland is burnt. And we've been able to do this before, but we've never been able to do it in a sort of reasonably automated way, which would allow us to measure it over time. So Mike's project has been about creating a methodology, a remote sensing and GIS methodology that allows us every year to say, what was the burning this year? What was the burning this year? You know, so we can look at changes over time, and we can look at changes, we can look at burning patterns in relation to deep peat, in relation to peatland restoration, in relation to protected areas, and stuff like that. So the early stuff that's coming out of Mike's project is showing that the amount of moorland that's being burnt has declined over time, but when you look at it in Scotland and in England, it's largely driven by a reduction in England, and we think that's driven by a change in regulation that came in England a year or two ago that banned burning on deep peat. And so what we hope is we'll see a similar trend in Scotland when the Scottish Government introduced the licensing of moor burn later this year. Stephen Ewing, who sits in my team, manages Nick Wilkinson, who ran this project. Again, this was a joint project between my team and the monitoring team, and this was about understanding changes in capercaillie populations in Scotland. So this was the 6th time that we'd monitored capercaillies in Scotland, and unfortunately the capercaillie population has declined by about 52% since we last counted them in 2015, and has gone from nearly 2,000 individuals in the early 90s to about 500 individuals now. So this is a species which is in trouble. And it's in trouble despite the fact that there's been loads of conservation resources spent on this species. And what that tells me is we've not been doing the right thing for this species in the right places. So what I'm hoping will happen off the back of this survey is, because we've got a snapshot of where all the capercaillie are in winter from this survey and in the breeding season from the let counts that happen, we should be able to target, we should be able to really look at it and say, well, what is it that's affecting this hotspot, that hotspot, and try and target the right conservation action. And we've got other projects running simultaneously that are testing other, conservation methods that might help capercaillie. So we are running out of time for this species, and we're going to have to work fast, but we will try. Cairngorms Connect, you might have heard of Cairngorms Connect. It's the best known of our landscape scale restoration projects, I think largely because it's been one of the longer running ones. It was one of the earliest projects funded through the Endangered Landscapes programme. And the great thing about Cairngorms Connect is a landscape scale restoration project, multi-partner, huge area in the Cairngorms this is covering, and it's about restoration of not just one habitat, it's about woodlands, peatlands and floodplains. So it's like ecosystem restoration. And there's an extensive science programme embedded within this. So there's too much to talk about today. But I put this up because really excitingly later in the year, the Cairngorms Connect science team have been asked to host a knowledge exchange event. So all of the other the Endangered Landscape Programme projects from across Europe, and there are 14 of them, they're all going to amass on the Cairngorms later this year to learn about the sort of science work that we've been doing to support landscape restoration. So that's really exciting for them to be able to showcase what we've been doing in the Cairngorms. And then last but by no means least, I've got a lot of the people in the department who work on seabirds and marine issues in my team, because a lot of the seabird, most of the seabirds are in Scotland, and a huge amount of their time has been taken up by avian influenza in the last year. And one of the big projects we've got this year is just to try and assess the impacts of what happened to our seabirds last year. And we're really fortunate in that we just finished a full census of all the seabirds in the UK, a 7-year project counting 26 species across the UK. That was finished in 2021. The results of that will be published soon, and of course it's already completely out of date. But what it does do is it gives us a phenomenal baseline against which we can go out and measure the effects of avian influenza. So the team have got £400,000 of funding in place to do this. They've got the team ready to go, and they're just going to be sending people out to count the seabirds, the ones that we think were really badly affected, and in the places we know they were really badly affected. And hopefully what we'll have at the end of that is an idea of the population impact of avian influenza on a whole bunch of our seabird species. So that, I hope that's given you a bit of an understanding of the conservation, RSPB Centre for Conservation Science. And you know, if you leave with one thing today, I think the message I'd like you to take away is that RSPB is an evidence-based organisation. All of our decisions are founded in evidence, and that's why we have such a big science team. You know, I've got 25 in my team, but the whole department at the moment, there's 88 people in the department. The other thing that's great at the moment is we have 50-50 gender split right now, which is the first time that has happened ever. So that's it was really good the other day to clock that one. If you want to know more, we have got a website. It's horrifically out of date, but our website is being revamped in the summer. It's still worth a look because it will still tell you a lot more than I can tell you today. But we're very active on Twitter. We've got a science communication member of staff whose whole role is about communicating our science, and she's brilliant at promoting our stuff on Twitter. And we usually publish, most of our papers we turn into blogs and publish on our Saving Nature with Science blog. So that's just some places that you could get a little bit more, understanding if you want to. Right, species conservation. This is a black-tailed godwit. This specific black-tailed godwit is a very special black-tailed godwit. This is Edith. She was the first bird, first godwit to be reared in captivity and then became part of the wild breeding population in the UK. And she's been phenomenal. She has raised chicks every year since she came back and started breeding. So she was the very, very first bird that did that. And that was her at the end of her very first breeding season. You can see she's already starting to molt. End of her first breeding season when she reared 2 chicks. But you'll know more about the captive breeding thing in a second. So black-tailed godwits are a really rare species in the UK. There were only 44 pairs in 2017, and 38 of those pairs were in the Cambridgeshire Fens. And within the Cambridgeshire Fens, 35 of those pairs were at one site. So we've got a really small breeding population and a really high reliance on a single site. So we've done a lot of work on black-tailed godwits over the years. So this is the ooze washes, which is not the site where they are now. This is the site that used to be the stronghold for them. The photo at the top is the ooze washes. The graph at the bottom is the change in population size over time from the early 70s through to now. So it went from around 60 pairs in the early 70s to 3 pairs now. And the problem is really nicely illustrated by this photograph. We did a load of diagnostic research in the late 90s, early noughties that told us that the frequency of spring flooding on the ooze washes was the thing that was causing this decline. The birds were attempting to breed, then the washes would flood, and that was at end of breeding seasons. And that happened in 17 out of 30 years. So their productivity, their breeding success was too low because of flooding, and the population declined massively. The solution, so there was lots of solutions identified, including how to stop this spring flooding. But the problem is that the ooze washes takes all the flood water for central England. So if you do anything that affects the ooze washes, it affects a large part of England in terms of its flooding. So very difficult to do anything on the ooze washes itself. So the solution that was identified was to buy land and recreate grassland. This would all have been grassland at one point, this whole area. It would have all been a big wetland, this whole area, but it's been converted into high-grade agricultural land. It's peaked, beautiful land for growing stuff in. So buy land, convert it back into habitat for godwits that is outside of the flood banks and therefore doesn't flood in the breeding season. But the problem was that it took quite a long time to buy the land because it's expensive and farmers don't want to give it up. And then when we bought it, it takes a while to restore it. And by the time we'd done that, the population was down to 3 pairs. And that's not a sustainable population by anybody's books. However, at the same time as that population was declining at the ooze washes, the neem washes population was increasing. The neem's about 30 kilometres away. The neem washes population was increasing and went up quite rapidly during the 1990s. And then something happened in 2006. It hit its peak and then it just stalled and then it started to decline again. And really fortunately, when we were doing the diagnostic research at the ooze washes to understand the problems there, and that was one of my first research contract was on this project, we also did exactly the same work at the neem washes as a comparison to the ooze washes. So we had these really great data sets in terms of we colour marked loads and loads of birds in that time, and a lot of those birds were still alive, and we monitored nest survival and chick survival. So we had a historical data set that we could go back and repeat to try and understand what was happening at the neem washes, and that's exactly what we did. So in 2015 and 16, we had a couple of years of going back looking for all these colour marked birds, monitoring as many nests as we could, monitoring chicks through to fledging or failure, and then we could compare the two time periods. So the time period when the population was increasing rapidly to the time period when the population was declining. And so what we found was that the recent decline was due to insufficient breeding success, and that's because nest survival and chick survival were both significantly lower now than they were in the past. What these graphs show is the seasonal change in survival for nests on the left and chicks on the right. The bottom line in the graph is now, the top line in the graph is in the past. And these differences are pretty large. So at day 15 in the season, in the past, the likelihood of a nest surviving incubation was 71%, now it's 42%, and for chicks, in the past it was 43%, and now it's 12%. So declines in both nest and chick survival. And there were no changes in adult survival. In fact, adult survival was slightly higher now than in the past, so it's not driven by anything happening to these birds when they leave the breeding grounds. It's all down to breeding season processes. And because we were doing all this detailed monitoring, we had temperature loggers in nests, we had cameras on nests, we had trail cameras dotted around all over the place. We know the causes of that poor nest and chick survival. And it was predation by a whole heap of different predators, not just one thing, all of these things. And in different years, these things have different effects. So in some years it was all about foxes, in other years it was the marsh harriers ate all the chicks, and in other years it was like a combination of them all. So that makes it quite a difficult problem to tackle. Anyway, what I'm going to show you now is just a little 2-minute video, which will give you, give my voice a rest for 2 minutes, but it will also give you a feel for the site, a feel for the species, and a feel for the issues involved. Did come back because you come back in 2020 and do the migration story, and of course COVID hit. So, but hopefully that gives you a sort of feel for the species and the site and stuff. That nest that was predated was a badger, by the way. There was a nest camera. There was a nest camera by that nest, and I knew it was a badger when I got there because it was just like this big swathe of vegetation that had been flattened by this big badger going through the vegetation, and they always leave the eggs at the nest in a mess. So we've done all the diagnostic research which tells us what we need to do, and at the same time we were applying for funding to instigate this big species recovery project, and we were really lucky to get that funding. And what we ended up with, we called it Project Godwit, and it was a partnership project between us and the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, and the large majority of our funding came from EU Life. So because we knew that breeding success was the problem, we had to instigate conservation interventions that were designed to improve breeding success. And we did that in 2 ways. The first thing we did was to try and improve breeding success in the wild. So we planned to deploy a range of predator management solutions to try and increase nest and chick survival in the wild. And then we also wanted to trial the use of head starting, this captive rearing technique, which is relatively new and innovative and hadn't been used in a wader species in the UK before. So we had a whole range of predator species that we needed to try and reduce the impacts of. So we couldn't just deploy one predator management solution because that wouldn't have worked at all. The other thing is the godwits didn't really have time for us to mess around testing and trialling everything. And we didn't really need to do that because we'd done lots of tests and trials of lots of predator management solutions in other study systems in the past. So we knew we had a range of sort of tools in the conservation toolkit that we could deploy with some certainty that they might be effective. But where we did use anything that was relatively novel, we tried to deploy it in a way that we could test it. So the first thing we did, and I think this is probably, I would say this is, in this situation, a line of defence is lethal predator control. We knew that foxes were a problem, and we've got plenty of scientific literature that tells us if you target lethal predator control in the right way, it can be effective at increasing breeding success in waders. But we were also quite realistic in that we know you can never remove all the foxes. We also knew that that there's always foxes waiting to come back into any decent quality habitat. So if you remove a fox in February or March time, there's another fox waiting to move back into that habitat. And we also knew that the sites we were working on were going to be really tricky in terms of fox control because they flood in winter. And actually, to do fox control really well, you need to start in January, do a really good job January to March to knock back the fox population, try and interrupt the breeding. That's when foxes are breeding, so you don't end up with vixens with lots of cubs to feed and therefore going out and preying on your waders. But sometimes these sites are underwater for those months. So we knew we couldn't rely on this alone. So we also used two different predator exclusion fencing options. There's heaps of literature around this on the efficacy of predator exclusion fences, but of course there's lots of different ways you can do it. So we used two methods. We used a permanent exclusion fence. We couldn't put that around the whole site because it's just the way the water moves and everything. You just couldn't do it. So what we concentrated on was trying to exclude things from coming into the site at the two ends where the access routes were, and that's what we used the permanent exclusion fencing for. And then we used temporary electric fencing around the core godwit breeding areas. So we knew the fields that the godwits all were bred in, and we tried to fence as much of that area as we could. It's quite an intensive method because you've got to put it up at the beginning of the breeding season, you've got to every day check it, you've got to clear the vegetation from beneath it. So we couldn't do it everywhere, but we tried to do it in the really important places. And that was novel. This in-ditch low fence was novel, so we did it in a way that allowed us to test the effectiveness of it. And because we knew red kites sometimes took a lot of the godwit chicks, not every year, but sometimes took a lot of the godwit chicks and occasionally took nests. And we knew we had one pair of red kites, and because we'd done work on diversionary feeding, we decided to diversionary feed the single pair of kites that was adjacent to the site. We'd done some work on diversionary feeding red kites before. We'd also done work on diversionary feeding with kestrels preying on terns before. So those are the predator management solutions that we deployed. In terms of the effectiveness of the temporary fencing, so we had a couple of years, 2015 and 16, where we did no fencing and nest survival was about 40%. For the next 3 years, we had fields that were fenced and fields that weren't fenced, and the blue bars and lines are the fenced fields. So we had a significant improvement in nest survival in the fields that were fenced using those short temporary electric fencing compared to fields without. So we can say for sure that that is increasing nest survival. And we were just really lucky that at the same time some Dutch colleagues were doing exactly the same thing for godwits in the Netherlands, and we put the data sets together and managed to publish a collaborative paper on that, because I think on its own it wouldn't have made much of a paper, but because it was sort of two country, big godwit populations, we got that through. We can't say how effective our lethal control was. We can't say how effective our permanent fencing was. What we can say is that over the course of the 5 years we were monitoring it intensively, we massively reduced fox activity on the site because we had a constant effort trail camera monitoring scheme on the whole site. And in 2015, before we started anything, we had 115 images of foxes in one season. In 2019, we only had 1 image of fox. So we definitely reduced fox activity through the combined effect of all of this predator management. But ultimately what we're trying to do is we're trying to increase productivity. Did we manage to increase productivity of godwits breeding in the wild? Unfortunately, we didn't. No effect whatsoever. We thought we were getting somewhere in 2018 when the blue bar went above the dotted line. The dotted line is the line they need to achieve in order to maintain stable populations. So if they got that every year, the population would be flatlined. And the productivity on the y-axis is the number of chicks fledged per pair of godwits. So they only need to fledge 0.4 of a chick each year, like half a chick a year, 1 every other year. We'd get them stability, but they're not even getting there. And we didn't manage to improve it. And the reason, so over the 6 years of Project Godwit, only 56 chicks fledged from the wild in 6 years. So keep that number in your head, 56, because when we get to the head starting bit, it's important to have that number. The reason we think this is a whole bunch of things. So we can only protect the percentage of the nests with the temporary electric fencing. So the unprotected nests still had really poor nest survival. We can only instigate predator management interventions that influence some of the predators, not all of the predators. So the temporary fencing we think probably did exclude badgers, but possibly didn't. And stoats, we can't do anything about stoats. Marsh harriers, we can't do anything about marsh harriers. So there's a whole bunch of species that we can't really do much about. But I think the most important thing here is that chick survival, godwit chick survival, remained extremely low. And the reason for that is that we can't protect the areas that they take the chicks to. They take the chicks to the wet bits. So early in the season, those wet bits are completely underwater, so we can't fence them. And late in this, you just can't. So they're just too wet. And they all migrate from their nesting fields to these 2 wet fields at the end of the site. And we think that just creates a honeypot that is just an easy place for avian predators to eat them. And we think that's probably the principal reason why productivity doesn't increase. So we can do something about nest survival. It's very difficult to do anything about chick survival. So head starting. So head starting is a really innovative new thing to do. It's been done for a couple of other wader species, notably spoonbill sandpipers in Russia, the rarest wader in the world. But this was the first time head starting had been done for a species of wader in the UK. And basically what you do is you basically remove the breeding attempt from the wild, and you rear the whole lot in captivity, and then you release them when they're fledged. So you take eggs from the wild, you take the earliest clutches in the season, early in incubation, because godwits will relay if you take the clutch away. It's just like a predator going along and eating their eggs. We're just taking away and put them in an incubator. We had some birds relay within 5 days of taking their clutches. We take them into an incubator, we rear the chicks indoors for sort of 4 days after they hatch, and then they go outside into the habitat that they would be in. There's godwits, there's godwits in that habitat, there's other waders in that habitat, but they're in a safe enclosure, and you rear them until the point of fledging, which is about 28 to 30 days, and you look after them until that point. So the primary objective really is to boost productivity. Can we fledge loads more chicks by rearing them in captivity than we can fledge in the wild? But the other really useful tool, possibly, is that you can facilitate colonisation of new sites with this technique. So if you remember, I said we have all that wet grassland around the ooze washes, but no godwits to colonise it. Godwits are really philopatric. They tend to come back. Chicks will tend to come back and breed where they hatched from. So it's quite difficult to get them to spread out into new locations. But by rearing them in captivity and releasing them in the new locations that you want them to come back to, can that facilitate colonisation? So those are the 2 things that we were trying to test with head starting here. So does head starting increase productivity? Yes. So remember, 56 chicks fledged from the wild in 6 years, 204 chicks fledged from head starting from 248 eggs. So really good success rate in terms of going from egg to fledged chick. And if you put that on the graph, so that's exactly the same graph we saw before. The red bar now is the added effect of the birds fledged from captivity, and you can see in every year we managed to head start. We didn't head start in 2020 for obvious reasons. Productivity is way above what it needs to be. In terms of facilitating colonisation, All the eggs came from the Nene. They were transported to Lady Fen, which is on the ooze washes, and they were all reared in captivity there. 70% of them were released there, so you just open the doors of the cage and let the birds fly out, walk out, they join other flocks of waders immediately. 30% were boxed up and driven back to the Nene washes and released there in what we call a hard release. So they just had a few minutes to get over the journey, and then you open the temporary enclosure and off they went. And of the birds, the birds that we've done the two different methods to, we've got 110 that would have been old enough to recruit in 2021. 10 have recruited to the Nene washes, 27 to the Lady Fen, and 10 to the pilot project that had no godwits at the beginning of the project. So it does promote colonisation. These birds are able to survive in the wild and come back and recruit at age 1 or age 2 and some at age 3. These birds are now making a significant contribution to the population. So ultimately, what we were trying to do is to save black-tailed godwits from extinction in the UK. Have we achieved that? I mean, I think what we've done is we've bought the population a whole bunch of time. The decline at the Nene washes has slowed, and the population is now, the birds are now less reliant on that site. 92% of the population used to breed at that site. Now it's 65% because we've got them spread out a bit. The numbers breeding at these washes are higher than they have been for the last 20 years. The population's had an injection of young birds. We knew the population was ageing because of all the colouring birds we had. We had many birds that were 20 plus years old. So that's a good thing. They've had an injection of young birds. But this is not because we fixed the problems in the wild. This is because we've done all of this captive rearing. We should see these numbers go up for another couple of years yet, because we did our last year of head starting last year. So we've got another couple of years of seeing those numbers go up. But after that, it'll just be down to the breeding success in the wild at that point. So we've got no resolution to that predation problem at the Nene washes. So I think we've bought the population a lot of time. But I think what we need to do now is, now we know head starting works, I think we now need to try and get this species out of the Cambridgeshire fens and back into the other places where they used to be in England. They were in Norfolk, they were in the southwest, they were in the northwest. They were much more abundant and spread out than they were in the past. And that's what we're sort of toying with, how we fund and do that in future through the Species Action Plan. So it's not easy, it takes a lot of money, it also takes a lot of people, and this is just some of the people that have been involved in this project. But huge thanks to our partners, WWT. They led on all the head starting bit of it because they had all the agricultural expertise, and of course the EU Life Nature Programme, who mostly funded a large majority of this project. So that's it, thanks.
So we've got 5 minutes left.
Sorry, that went on a bit longer than it did last time.
But I mean, for those that can stay, maybe a few minutes after.
Yeah, I'm not in a hurry. Yeah.
So yeah, any questions in the room, I'll give priority for those that make it in the room. And then if anyone on Teams has a question, if they can either raise their hand or put something in the chat, I'll come to you next. So,
I was wondering quickly, the Dutch researchers also did head starting?
Yes, they did, yeah. But their head starting wasn't for conservation reasons. They were running a really cool migration experiment. So they basically head started loads of godwits, and then there's always 4 eggs in a clutch of godwits, well, mostly 4 eggs in a clutch of godwits. So they created 4 groups, one egg from each clutch. And they had 2 groups that were released in the Netherlands, 1 group early, 1 group late. So the early group were released and there's still adult godwits around. Late group held back, released after a lot of the adult godwits had migrated. The other 2 groups were an early and late group, but they were transported to Poland. And interestingly, the birds that were transported to Poland went back to Poland to breed. So what that tells me is that birds don't learn about where they're going to be, they don't get their sense of place until they're flying. Once they're flying, and it sort of makes sense, doesn't it? Once they're flying and they get an idea of a landscape, then that's them going, oh, this is where I come back to breed. It's not about where you were reared necessarily. I think it's much more about once they know where they are in their landscape in their head, then that's where they come back to. So yeah, theirs wasn't a conservation reason, but they were doing it at the same time.
I have a question on Teams. What volunteers do you need in Scotland?
What volunteers? Oof, depends what they want to do. I mean, we use volunteers for, RSPB uses volunteers for lots of their work. We don't use volunteers quite so much in conservation science, but we prefer to work with students and master students, PhD students, internships, those sorts of things, because I think people get a much more rounded and better experience by having that sort of experience rather than just coming and volunteering for a day. There's not really a huge, unless you're going out to a bird survey, there's not really a huge amount you can do in a day with the science team.
Cool. Any other questions in the room? Kirsty.
So there's quite a bit of evidence, isn't there, that this species-focused interventions, I mean, obviously you were talking about something quite specific there, but there have been other projects, I'm thinking kind of agri-environment schemes as well, where the species-focused interventions seem to work quite a lot better than trying to do a broader brush approach. But at the same time, you can't do really intensive species interventions for every single species that needs it. So I just wondered if you had any comments on how we square that circle.
Yeah, it's a really tricky one because there's a huge amount of evidence that shows, you know, when you do the species stuff, you get much better results than trying to be broad brush. But there is also quite a lot of evidence that shows the wider biodiversity benefits of some of the species stuff. So a lot of the stuff that was delivered for stone curlews has huge biodiversity benefits for a whole range of other birds, but also massive benefits for you know, invertebrates and plants and stuff like that as well. So I think we need to do more of those sorts of studies that says, you know, this was designed for this species, but look at everything else that benefits, because often the solutions are about, you know, taking things back 30 years, less intensive ways of managing your margins or your centre of your fields or whatever. And of course that will benefit, but you know, more biodiversity than that wheat crop that we've been growing there otherwise. So I think we need to do more of that sort of thing. How can we show the wider benefits more often? It is a tricky one. It is a tricky one because the broad brush stuff often does next to nothing.
Do you think it's because maybe some of it's not done very well?
Well, there's that.
Whereas when you've got that really species focus, you've probably got a ton of advice coming from organisations like RSPB and other organisations, so that maybe those are just implemented much better, and some of the broad brush stuff could work if it was implemented. I don't know.
I mean, and that's often I mean, I think. Yeah, the difficulty with that, of course, is that how the heck do you implement the broad brush stuff at a big scale? You know, with that hand holding that you often need to do with the species stuff, and that's sometimes why the species stuff falls down, because you can only do a certain amount of that hand holding. And if you can't do it everywhere, then the delivery elsewhere is not as good, or it just doesn't happen at all. You know, so you get very low uptake. So that, you know, we once Tony, our research manager, he used to do research. I mean, he once identified this fantastic solution for skylark pots, but it was brilliant when we tested it. But it just never got. It just for some reason didn't fly with farmers. Never got rolled out to the extent that it actually started to impact skylark at a population level.
I have that in my one of my lectures. as an example of how.
So that's an example of getting to stage 3 on my sort of solutions thing, and then it falling down at the last stage. It just never got rolled out enough to actually impact the skylark population.
So I've got one on Teams just before we go hit 2. So how would someone find out about the RSP conservation projects and how they could get involved?
I think the website is probably the best place to start. We have a specific department, a volunteering department. So they're often the first port of call for people, and what the volunteering department will do is they'll speak to the person that gets in touch with them, and they'll find out what it is they'd like to do, and then they try to match them to the right thing. So quite often we'll get a request, you know, have you got anything? We've got someone here who's got some really good data skills and they want to help the science team. Have you got something we can help you with? So they try their best to match people to.
I can add to that. If that's a conservation and ecology student asking that question, they can come talk to me because we have placements. As part of their degree, and I know some folk at RSPB, so I could always chat to people in conservation science to see if they've got something suitable for a student. We have also in the past had students do their dissertations on RSPB projects, which are already happening, and they contribute to those and they can use that to write up their dissertation projects. So there's a couple of additional ways.
Thanks. So just to be aware that that's 1 minute past 2 for anyone that does have to leave, but we've got a few minutes, I think, if we've got anxiety and questions.
Thanks for awesome talk.
Thank you.
I think plants, not birds, but
it's all right. I'm not going to school you down.
I've got a question, but it's one when I used to teach like the creation of these species action plans. I used to get the students asking all the time, at what point do you stop?
at what point do we stop for a species?
Yeah.
Give up, you mean? Oof. It's a really hard thing to do, and it's a really hard thing to get your colleagues to do.
I never know how to
Yeah.
answer it. so
Yeah, yeah. I mean, sometimes you do, though. I mean, it's that thing about balancing. If you've tried everything, like if we hadn't, if the Head Start hadn't have worked, I'd have gone, oh God, we're going to lose Gorbets. That's it. We're going to lose them. Population will just, disappear over the next 20 years, and then that'll be it. So I think it is that. Have you absolutely tried everything? How much resource do you have to put in for the likelihood of success? Would that resource be better on something where your likelihood of success is high? I mean, it is hard. It's just that prioritisation is hard. And you'll always get someone who's championing a species because it's a pet species or whatever. We've just gone through a process. I wasn't involved, thank God. But we've just gone through a process where we've just gone through our priority species lists. And sort of had another look, and some of the questions were, that's been a priority species for us for ages. Have we been able to deliver anything? No, because sometimes it's out of your gift. It might be, I don't know, persecution of the last few Montagu's Harriers or something like that. So it is,
And presumably sometimes I'm thinking of Capercaillie here, where climate change is not going to help Capercaillie either.
No.
And does this feed into your prioritisation whether the action is really only for that species, or for example, when I challenge people from RSPB about Capercaillie work before, they have pointed out to me that a lot of that work is about really broad-scale habitat restoration, which is going to benefit lots of different species, even if ultimately Capercaillie don't benefit.
So sometimes you can hang over the conservation work on a species because it's an iconic species or sexy species, and you can hang it on that. But actually, it's the wider benefits of everything you're doing for that species that's the real conservation benefits. So ultimately, we might lose Capercaillie, but we'll have loads more Caledonian pinewood in good condition. I mean, I think the reason we lose Capercaillie is people. I have to say, I think it's the human disturbance that's really nailing them now. I do think it's that since COVID, the numbers of are extraordinary, and they're super sensitive species to disturbance. So, and that's not something RSPB can tackle. That's something the Cairngorms National Park has to tackle in terms of zoning. In terms of zoning, where people can't go at different times of the year, or education, or rangers on the ground. We need boots on the ground to stop the behaviour. So it's very difficult. It is very difficult.
See, this is also why we're
And you get people
levels of weight.
people who put their whole career into a species, and then to be told RSPB's not got that as a priority anymore. I mean, people have left because of their species that they've built their career on has gone down the path. We keep trying.
That's amazing.
But you do have to prioritise.
So there's a couple of last questions on Teams. So first one, Gemma, what is causing the increased predation of the breeding bird population?
That's a really good question. Well, we think lots
Sounds
of
like an
reasons.
exam question.
Sorry. I could write pages and pages on that one. Well, I mean, there's lots of reasons. I mean, there's lots of things I blame the high numbers of predators on. I mean, the changes that we made in the landscape, I think, have made the landscapes less suitable for specialist species that we're trying to conserve and much more suitable for these generalist predators. We have far fewer, 100 years ago there would have been heaps of gamekeepers and their principal job would have been predator management. We don't have that anymore, so these predators have got a free run. We would have had apex predators that would have been preying on these predators, things like lynx, golden eagles and seagulls and stuff are coming back now, so I think that's going to help. But lynx, wildcats, wolves, all of those predators would have suppressed a lot of these what we call mesopredators in the past. I think we have to blame conservation a little bit because, marsh harriers are red kites are a conservation success story, but they're eating my Gorbets. And of course we create these nature reserves that are fantastic, but of course the predators are going to come to the nature reserves because the surrounding land is rubbish. So it's all of those things combined, I think. And that's not easy to solve. Definitely not.
Thanks. And the last one was from Archie was, in terms of working for an organisation like the RSPB, is a PhD a requirement to work in a conservation science department like yours?
No, not a requirement. It's handy, it's not a requirement. And we've been having lots of conversations recently about all our job adverts, especially for sort of senior conservation scientists and up, say PhD or equivalent. We're like, what do we mean by equivalent? You know, what would be equivalent? Lucy, who I talked about in that talk, Lucy worked very effectively as a conservation scientist for many years without a PhD. And actually, when you said to people she didn't have a PhD, really? She doesn't have a PhD? You know, and then, you know, and it was just because circumstance meant that she just, you know, she was working her way through, and then eventually she published enough papers, they were all of a story, and we put them together, and she got a PhD by publication. So you don't need it. I think there's a sort of societal.
It's generally expected.
It's expected. It's expected.
Research,
Yeah.
not for conservation as a whole body of career choices. I mean, there's lots of different jobs in conservation, but my impression is for research in conservation, it is normally expected.
Yeah, it's expected. But if you think about what a PhD is, you know, it's 3 or 4 years, you know, intensively studying, leading, publishing, you know, on that subject. You can get that in a job. You can get that exact experience in a job and more. Yeah, but we're just thinking about it. We're thinking about it in relation to our EDI work, or equality, diversity, inclusive work. Because actually, you know, from a recruitment perspective, you're like, do they actually need a PhD, or do they just need the same experience that somebody gets from doing a PhD?
Yeah. It might put someone off that has that 4 years.
Especially women.
Amazing, of course.
Yeah,
And they'll just look at that and be like, oh no, not good enough for that.
Yeah. So we're looking at all these things. Yeah.
And I guess the PhD by publication route, did you find that easy?
PhD by publication was perfect for Lucy. You know, she had 7 papers that were all on a topic, and she just enrolled at. We enrolled her at UEA. She was enrolled for 6 months. She wrote a critical review, which was like 10,000 word thing that pulled together the story of the 7 papers and her contribution to that research area. And she got a PhD, and then went on maternity leave.
Just to add to that, another organisation I work a lot with is Forest Research, and they've got quite a few research scientists who don't necessarily have PhDs, but one of them then, their line manager thought that they could benefit by that experience, so she did her PhD part-time with me at Stirling at the same time as doing the job. So I think
we've got a few people doing part-time
PhD routes to doing that.
Especially if you bring them in, you know, if we bring somebody in on a fixed-term contract for a 5-year project, well, they know that they've got 5 years there. You know, if you could say to them at the beginning, well, actually, you know, that could work towards a PhD at the end of that. It's a brilliant development opportunity. Then B, we're much more likely to keep them for the whole project. Then you don't have staff turnover in a project, which is difficult when it's a big project like that. So, yeah, there's lots of benefits, and I think, you know, sort of developing people in their job towards that is just as good as someone coming just done a PhD.
I guess it's part of the sales pitch to bring people in. That's an offer potentially to people as well if they want to take that route. Just making that clear how it works. You know, even for people in universities, the PhD by publication and how to go through the process. And
it's really interesting. And every university is slightly different in the way they approach that, but it's a good option for everybody.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Jen. I think we'll let you go and escape. So, but yeah, thank you again for the talk.
Thank you.
Okay.